Distinguished future physicians, welcome to Stomp on Step 1, the only free video series that helps you study more efficiently by focusing on the highest yield material. In this video, I'm going to be covering the different types of study design, such as meta-analysis, cohort, case control, case series, and cross-sectional study. This is the 8th video in my biostats section, and I suggest you check out the rest of these when you're done with this one.
Based on certain types of bias that are inherent in some study designs, we can rank the different types of study design based on their validity. These study designs at the top, like meta-analysis, have the highest validity, while designs like a case series have the lowest level of validity. In most cases, if you've got two studies on the same topic that come to different conclusions, you would assume the trial of the more valid type is correct. However, this isn't always the case. Just because something is a meta-analysis of randomized control trials doesn't necessarily mean it's a great study. All these studies designs can have bias, and a really well-designed, executed cohort study might have more valid results than a poorly designed or poorly executed randomized trial.
See here in the top right corner that I give meta-analysis a high yield rating of 1. For those of you who don't know what that is, it is a rating scale from 1 to 10 that gives you a rough estimate for how important each topic is for step 1. And if you'd like to learn more about that rating system, please visit my website.
Meta-analysis is the process of taking results from many different studies and combining them to reach a single conclusion. Doing this is sort of like having one giant study with a really large sample size. So it should be intuitive that this is going to be the study design with the highest validity. However, there still can be bias in these studies. A meta-analysis is really only as good as the data you're entering into it. So it's only as good as the studies that you're including in this meta-analysis. If you've got a bunch of individual studies that all have bias, the conclusion you make for the meta-analysis can also have a lot of bias. Randomized control trials, or just RCT, are the gold standard of research for therapeutic and preventative interventions. This is because they have very high validity, and they're types of experimental studies rather than observational studies. Most of the other things like cohort and case control, case series, those are all observational studies. This is experimental. And in experimental studies, you have a much higher level of control, and that's good because you can really isolate that one factor that you want to study and make everything else similar between the two groups. Things like randomization and blinding aren't possible in most observational study designs, but in a randomized control trial, you can use those methods. The biggest difference between an experimental study like randomized control trial and other observational studies is how participants are assigned to different groups. In a randomized control trial, the researchers assign through a number of techniques, most often randomization. And in an observational study, natural conditions essentially assign what group a person ends up. Things like personal preference, genetics, social determinants, environment, lifestyle, all those things end up exposing somebody to a certain risk factor or end up with them getting a certain treatment. When you're doing an observational study, you're really just watching things that would have happened anyway. You're just trying to be a fly on the wall and sort of see what happens on its own and take notes. You can obviously imagine there's a lot of opportunities for bias in an observational study because you don't have control over so many different things. A cohort study is the observational study design with the highest validity. Cohort is really just a fancy name for group, and that should help you remember the difference between cohort and some of the other studies. Because in cohort studies, you start with a group of people, some of whom happen to have the exposure and some who don't. Then you follow this group of people over time and monitor how often certain diseases or health outcomes arise. So you're basically just monitoring the incidence of whatever you're studying. So what I described was a prospective cohort study, and that's easier to understand conceptually, but it's also possible to do a retrospective cohort study. In this case, you identify a group of people in the past, again, some of whom have the exposure, some who don't. And then you identify over time, over the last, how many ever years, the incidence of your certain outcome of interest. In case control studies, which are sort of the opposite of cohort studies, you first identify the people who have the health outcome of interest. Then you carefully select a group of controls that are very similar to that disease population, except they don't have that particular disease. Then you determine whether or not participants from each group had the particular exposure in the past. So this is a retrospective study. Again, the name can help you remember what's going on here, because in a case control study, you first identify the cases and the controls. So the cases are the people with the disease, and the control are the people without the disease. In both groups, in the case group and the control group, you're going to have a mix of people who do and don't have the exposure, but you don't find that out until later. There isn't a huge difference between retrospective cohort study and a case control study. You're basically doing the exact same steps in a slightly different order, but it's good to know they are different and used in slightly different situations. A case series is an observational study with a very small sample size and no control group. In this case, all you're really doing is reviewing the medical records of a few people. The last study design that we're going to talk about is the cross-sectional study. And this is different than the other studies because the other studies we've talked about so far measure incidence. They're measuring the occurrence of something over time. But cross-sectional studies measure prevalence. Difference in incidence and prevalence, I've got a video on that as well that you should go back and watch. But basically with cross-sectional studies, you're trying to measure the prevalence of a certain exposure and the prevalence of a certain health outcome at the same time. So you want to know how many people have the disease and how many people have the exposure that you're also studying at one particular point in time. This study design makes it very difficult to come to the conclusion that there's an association between that risk factor and a disease, because you're not really sure if there's any kind of causal relationship between the two. You just know that they're both common or both uncommon, something like that. That doesn't mean the study design is not useful, because it's often very easy as far as resources and time to do some sort of cross-sectional study. And a lot of times you can get these results that are freely available through things like governmental websites, because they do these sorts of measurements, yearly, and then they just report it through various websites and other media platforms. In that case, you might be able to find somewhat of association by saying, hey, this city has a really high prevalence of this risk factor and a really high prevalence of this disease. So there might be some sort of association there. In that case, you'd want to dedicate more time and resources to do a different study design. The prevalence numbers would really just give you an idea of where would be best to look. So it's sort of just the first step in that process. And prevalence is still useful for a lot of other things when you're not trying to find an association. If you just want to measure the overall success of a healthcare system or how common something else is, prevalence is very useful.
Here are a list of related topics that I think are low enough yield that I chose not to cover them in my video. I would suggest not spending much time studying any of this until you've mastered all the higher yield material.
That brings us to the end of the video. If you like my videos, please consider making a small one-time donation on my webpage using PayPal or a credit card. Unlike similar study aids that are available for $100 or more, I'm releasing all this stuff completely free. I don't want to leverage students' test anxiety for a profit or contribute to your student debt. However, I also have 6 figures worth of medical school loans and have spent a nice chunk of change on this website for things like recording equipment, software, and web hosting. I am currently planning on expanding the content and features of Stomp on Step 1, but none of that will be possible if I continue to hemorrhage money like I am now. If everybody watching this video gave like $10, I'd have enough money to make those improvements to the site without digging any further into my own piggy bank. You probably spend more than that every day on your whipped Frappa Choco Double Mintachino with caramel on top. So why don't you give your body a chance to recover from the caffeine overdose and send a few of those bucks my way?